My aunt was 46 when her husband of 17 years left on a Tuesday in February. The worst kind of Ontario Tuesday, the kind where the sky presses down the same gray as the road, and everything smells like cold pavement and exhaust. He had his bags already packed. Two rolling suitcases she recognized from their anniversary trip to Portugal 4 years earlier, back when she still believed that kind of trip meant something. He told her he'd been unhappy for a long time, that they wanted different things now. He was calm the way he always was in difficult client meetings, the particular calm of a man who has already made his decision and is now simply executing it. She found out the rest of it 3 days later. A junior analyst from his firm posted photos from a ski weekend in Mont Tremblant, matching jackets, a bottle of wine at a chalet she recognized from a fifth anniversary weekend she and her husband had spent there together. The analyst's name was Tasha. She was 29. My aunt's husband had been managing her investment portfolio for 2 years. I was 27 at the time. My mother called me from Hamilton, her voice careful and even in the way it gets when she's trying to hold herself together on the phone. My aunt had no children. Over 17 years of marriage, she and her husband had shaped a life that accommodated his ambitions first and hers second, his Bay Street hours, his client dinners, his networking events, the expectations that came with a 4-bedroom house in Oakville, and a husband who was, in all visible ways, doing very well. My aunt had been a talented architectural designer before the marriage. During it, she'd freelanced selectively, turned down the bigger contracts, kept herself available. She'd told herself it was a partnership. That's what she'd believed. The divorce was a slaughter, and I use that word deliberately. My aunt went in relying on the Ontario Family Law Act, equalization of net family property. She'd heard those words from a friend who'd been through a divorce and come out reasonably whole, and she'd thought they meant protection. What she discovered was that the law protects what it can find. Her husband had spent approximately 14 months before he left quietly restructuring his professional interests. He moved ownership of certain assets into a holding corporation predating the marriage. He reclassified income streams. He hired a family law firm on Bay Street that effectively did nothing but protect high-net-worth men from the financial consequences of leaving marriages they'd stopped valuing. Her own lawyer was competent. He was not in the same weight class. She was awarded spousal support, temporary, reviewable, not enough to cover rent in a decent part of the city. The Oakville house had a second mortgage she hadn't known about in detail, and what equity remained went to creditors. She ended up in a 2-bedroom rental in Mississauga, furniture from Facebook Marketplace, a kitchen table from a church sale. 46 years old, 17 years of her working life contributed to a shared future that had just been dissolved methodically by someone who knew exactly how to do it. I drove out to see her about 6 weeks after the separation was finalized. We sat at that kitchen table, and she told me she was fine. She said it calmly, looking at the wall just past my shoulder. I didn't push it, but I drove home unsettled. The call came 2 weeks later. A paralegal from an estate firm in Peterborough had been trying to reach her since the autumn. My grandfather, her father, had died the previous October. In the chaos of the marriage disintegrating, my aunt had signed the basic estate forms and assumed there was nothing significant to deal with. My grandfather had been a modest man. He'd worked his entire career as a forensic accountant for a mid-size firm in Toronto, retired at 66, lived carefully, and his bungalow in Peterborough had long been understood to go to my mother and his other children. My aunt had expected nothing else. She hadn't known about the cabin. It was a property on a small lake in the Haliburton Highlands, northeast of Toronto, up a logging road that barely registered on any GPS. My grandfather had bought it in 1987, the paralegal explained, and had been paying the property taxes himself until he stopped. 4 years of arrears. The county had placed a lien of just under $7,400. If it wasn't resolved in 45 days, the property would go to municipal sale. My grandfather had revised his will 14 months before he died. The Haliburton property, Just the cabin, just that land went exclusively to my aunt, not to my mother, not to his other children, to her by name. She told me that after she got off the phone, she sat in her Mississauga apartment for a long time without moving. 20 acres of Haliburton bush, a potentially sellable piece of land, a way out of the hole she was in if she could reach it. She called her ex-husband. She asked for a short-term loan, just enough to clear the tax lien so she could sell the property and pay him back with interest. She told me it was the hardest call she'd made in her adult life. She had to prepare for it the way you'd prepare to do something physically painful. He listened. Then he said, "That's not my problem anymore." Not unkindly, which was somehow worse. Factually, the way you'd note that a charge was outside your billing scope. Not my problem anymore. And he ended the call. She told me about those 5 words more than once over the following year. I don't think it was the contempt in them, exactly. It was the ease. The way 17 years could be compressed for him into something that cost him nothing to say. She told me something shifted in her when she put the phone down. Not grief, something harder and quieter than grief. She sold a pearl necklace and a pair of gold earrings at a jeweler on Dundas Street, who gave her $8,300 for both. She wired the tax amount to the county, confirmed the lien release, packed a sleeping bag, a Coleman lantern, enough groceries from No Frills for a week, and drove north in her Subaru. The last stretch of road hadn't been graded recently. She drove it at 15 kilometers an hour, branches scraping the roof. When she finally reached the clearing and stopped the engine, she sat in the car for a moment, looking at what her father had left her. The cabin had once been a functional place. You could still see that underneath the damage, the proportions of it, the original craftsmanship of the log walls, but the east section of the roof had buckled under years of ice load. The porch tilted visibly to one side. Birch saplings had come up through the boards in 2 places. The windows were opaque with grime and old weather. She unlocked the door with a brass key the paralegal had mailed her and stepped inside. My grandfather had been the tidiest man I ever knew. His bungalow in Peterborough was organized the way forensic accountants organize everything. Files labeled, nothing out of place, a system for every category of object. She'd expected the cabin to reflect that discipline, even in neglect. What she found instead was a decade's worth of deliberate accumulation. Bankers' boxes ranked against the walls, each one labeled in the small, neat handwriting she recognized from birthday cards he'd sent her over the years. A metal folding table in the corner with a 2014 Dell laptop and an external hard drive connected by cable. A corkboard on the far wall with printed documents pinned in columns connected by different colored pieces of string. She told me it didn't look like a fishing retreat. It looked like a research operation. The power was off. She worked by lantern light that first night, opening boxes at random, trying to understand what she was looking at. Financial documents, spreadsheets, printed and annotated in pencil, regulatory filings, correspondence, some formal, some printed from email accounts she didn't recognize. Her first night was sleepless and cold, the wind finding the gaps in the old logs, and she told me she cried for a while in the dark, the long, exhausted kind, and then something in her went quiet and deliberate. She was not leaving until she understood what her father had built here. She worked through the boxes for 3 days, building a rough chronology. The material spanned from 2013 to less than a year before he died. It was meticulous in a way that only made sense if he'd been doing it on purpose, over a long period of time, with a specific goal in mind. On the 4th day, she found the locked cabinet. It was a 2-drawer steel filing cabinet pushed against the back wall of the bedroom, behind a wardrobe. The lock was old but solid. She found a long, flathead screwdriver in the kitchen drawer, and worked the cabinet open methodically, pulling at the drawer face until the lock mechanism gave with a sharp pop that echoed through the empty cabin. Inside the top drawer were 2 folders. The first was labeled Summary Meridian, 23 pages in her father's handwriting, plus printed tables and photocopied account statements. The second folder was thinner. On the tab, in pencil, he'd written her name. She opened the second folder first. It was a single page. He'd written it by hand. She thought probably recently. The paper wasn't yellowed. It said, "I don't know what your life looks like when you find this. I hope it's not what I suspected it might become. But if it is, if you're standing in this cabin because you have nowhere else to stand, then everything in this room is yours. Use it." That was all. She told me she sat on the floor of that back bedroom for a long time after she read it, holding the page. My grandfather had not been a man who expressed things directly. He gave practical gifts. He remembered things you'd mentioned once, months later, and acted on them quietly without ever drawing attention to the gesture. She'd understood him as a private person, someone who held himself carefully. She hadn't understood until that moment the specific shape of what he'd been doing all those summers up here. He'd known or feared. He'd sat in this cabin alone and prepared, just in case she ever needed it. She put the single page back in the folder, picked up the summary document, and began to read. Meridian Capital Partners was a Toronto-based investment management firm. Boutique, institutional, focused, a clean name on Bay Street. My grandfather had done a short consulting engagement with them in 2013, a post-retirement due diligence review for a client considering an acquisition. He'd found irregularities he couldn't fully substantiate at the time. Rather than walk away, he'd started gathering what he could. For 9 years. What he'd assembled was a documented record of how a portion of Meridian's client funds, routed through management fee structures that appeared legitimate on regulatory filings, were being transferred into offshore holding vehicles in Barbados and the Isle of Man. The funds generated returns that appeared in internal documents, but not in filings submitted to the Ontario Securities Commission. The offshore entities were controlled by the firm's founding partners. My aunt found the partnership agreement at the back of the top drawer. There were 3 names on it. She told me she almost didn't look, that she spent a moment before turning the page, aware that what she was about to read was going to change something she couldn't change back. Her husband's name was the 3rd one listed. He had been a founding partner since 2009. He had never told her. He'd framed his role, throughout their marriage, as primarily advisory, managing specific portfolios, not ownership, nothing that complicated their family finances in ways she'd need to understand. She hadn't pushed. She'd trusted him the way you trust someone whose financial disclosures you've signed without reading for 17 years because you believed you were on the same side. She drove into the nearest town the next morning and sat in a Tim Hortons parking lot for 2 hours, using the Wi-Fi on her phone. She wasn't calling family. She researched the CRA's offshore tax informant program. She looked up the OSC's whistleblower mechanisms. She identified a tax litigation firm in Toronto that had successfully represented whistleblower applicants in previous CRA enforcement actions. And she called the main number, said she had documentation of potential offshore tax non-compliance involving a registered investment firm, and asked for a consultation. They called her back the same afternoon. The lawyer who took her case was named Simone Laurent. I use her name because she matters. She was in her mid-50s, formerly of the Department of Justice's tax litigation section, before she moved into private practice to do exactly this kind of work. She was unhurried in a way that felt like precision rather than slowness. She finished every sentence. She didn't perform urgency she didn't feel. My aunt drove back to Toronto with the laptop, the external drive, and the 6 most critical bankers' boxes in the back of the Subaru. She met with Simone Laurent for 3 hours at her office near King Street West. She said very little during the meeting. She spread the materials across the conference table and let 9 years of her father's quiet work speak for itself. 4 days later, Simone Laurent called. She said, "I want you to understand what your grandfather built here. I've reviewed whistleblower applications for 2 decades. I've rarely seen documentation this complete from outside a regulatory body. The CRA will open a file." Then she said, There's also a separate matter. The Meridian partnership stake, at the valuations documented in these records, constituted a significant undisclosed asset during your divorce mediation. There are grounds to reopen the settlement. My aunt asked what that meant in plain terms. Simone Laurent said, "It means he lied to the court, and your grandfather left you everything you need to prove it." They filed the whistleblower application with the CRA's offshore tax informant program in early May. The filing was sealed. My aunt returned to Mississauga, took on the drafting contract she'd been too demoralized to accept for months, and waited. She told me later that the waiting was the hardest sustained experience of the entire ordeal. Not the financial ruin after the divorce, not the humiliation of the settlement, but the particular weight of holding something consequential and not being able to move with it, while ordinary months passed around her as if nothing had changed. 14 weeks after they filed, the CRA initiated a compliance action. Given the amounts involved, the RCMP's Integrated Market Enforcement Team was brought in. The Ontario Securities Commission opened a parallel proceeding into Meridian's regulatory disclosures. On a Thursday morning in September, my aunt woke up and opened the Globe and Mail on her phone before she got out of bed, the way she'd been doing every morning since May. A short item in the business section: Meridian Capital Partners had suspended all client operations pending regulatory review, 3 named founding partners. Her ex-husband was one of them. She read the paragraph 4 times. Then she got up, made coffee, and called me. There was no dramatic confrontation, no staged reckoning. His lawyers contacted Simone Laurent 8 days later, signaling interest in discussing a resolution to the outstanding family law matter. My aunt told Simone Laurent she wasn't interested in a resolution. The motion to reopen the divorce settlement was filed in November. His Meridian ownership stake, the concealed valuation, the offshore structures documented in my grandfather's files, all of it was in the affidavit. The hearing took 2 days. The judge's decision was unambiguous. The settlement was renegotiated. It's not my number to share. It belongs to my aunt, not to this story, but when she called me after signing, she sounded like herself for the first time in nearly 2 years. What became of her ex-husband? The CRA assessment ran into 8 figures. The OSC barred him from acting in any registered advisory or fiduciary capacity for 10 years. The Public Prosecution Service of Canada laid charges under the Income Tax Act. The criminal proceedings were ongoing when my aunt decided deliberately to stop following them. She told me that was the actual moment she finished leaving him. Not the separation date, not the new settlement. The morning she chose not to check the news. Tasha, the junior analyst, had quietly moved to a competing firm before any of this became public. My aunt told me, in a very matter-of-fact voice, that she didn't particularly think about her. She said that seemed like her problem to work out, not a mine. The OTIP award came through the following spring, 18 months after they filed. The percentage fell within the legislated range. The amount was enough to change the shape of things permanently. My aunt didn't move back to Oakville. She didn't try to reassemble what she'd had. She did something none of us saw coming. She hired a contractor, a woman who specialized in heritage log restoration, found through a Haliburton Building Association, and spent a full summer bringing the cabin back. Not flipping it, not renovating it to sell, restoring it. She kept the original log walls, cedar for the porch boards, a proper kitchen, a wood stove, a reading chair she found at an antique market in Minden. She runs her remote design practice from the back studio now. The room with the good northern light that falls long and even over the water in the mornings. She kept 2 of my grandfather's banker's boxes on a shelf in that studio, empty. She said she kept them to remember what patient, unglamorous work looks like, what it means to spend years building something careful and true without knowing exactly when it will matter, only that it will. She turned 49 last May. My mother and I drove up for her birthday. We sat on the cedar porch with mugs of tea, the lake flat and gray the way it gets in Ontario in early spring before the season shifts. Somewhere across the water, a loon called once and then was quiet. My aunt looked out at the lake without speaking for a while. Then she said, "He sat out here every summer. He never told me. I don't know if he expected I'd need it, or if he just needed to know it was there." She lifted her mug toward the tree line. I didn't have anything to say to that, so I just raised mine too. The cabin belongs to her. The lake belongs to her. The quiet is hers in a way that nothing she shared with her ex-husband ever quite managed to be. If you found what my aunt found, not the money, not the award, but the evidence, what would you do with it? Walk away and start clean, or see it through the way she did? Let us know in the comments. If this one stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're new here, subscribe and stick around. There's always another story worth telling on Royal Murmurs.